Thank you, Christian Broman, and thank you to the Quizlet team. All right, so show of hands, who here is a TypeScript user, begrudgingly or otherwise? Awesome, so that's most of you. So if you are a TypeScript user and you've worked in big projects, you've probably ran into a scenario like this one. You have a React component in front of you, maybe from a bloated library such as Material UI, and you want to figure out what are all of the properties on this React component, right? Simple question. So maybe you try hovering on it. It's your first instinct, and the hover information is like kind of useless here. It gives you some information about, you have API docs. You don't always get API docs. Maybe you try command clicking through sometimes, and you sort of have to go through this process, right? And you're like, all right, well, maybe it's in here, somewhere in here, right? And this is kind of a mess trying to make this work. Probably what you do is you do this thing, the box, right? The completion box. It's called completion info internally within TypeScript. And that's not too bad, right? You can sort of search through and go through. But what you end up doing a lot of, right, like let's say I want to do, on click, right? And so you have this process where, if I want to figure out more information about on click, again, hovering over it is useless. So you have to like write more code to trigger more completions, right? And then you want to figure out, I don't know, whatever it is, right? And you keep going to trigger more and more completions. And you kind of have this process where in order to discover the API surface of this TypeScript project, right, you have to keep tunneling through. So it's kind of like this project is like this dark room, and VSCode gives you a flashlight or something. But really, you just are like, just turn the lights on. Just let me see all of the types for my project at once, right? That's how I always felt about it, because the information's there, So as it turns out, I wasn't the only person who felt this ordeal was a little silly. Here's one issue where someone's saying, hey, like, basically hover info kind of sucks. Doesn't really do what it needs to. And then there was this suggestion by Josh Goldberg, who, if you don't know, he's sort of, I guess, the main person doing TypeScript ESLint. One of those like open source people who's really important, but more people should know of, so shout outs. And he was saying, hey, why doesn't someone make a VS Code extension, right? This could solve this problem very, very simply, right? And I was like, hey, I can write software. Why don't I do it? It seems easy. And usually when things feel easy in coding and it seems like somebody should have done it, but it doesn't exist, there's a reason. In this case, it's very complicated, as it turns out, to understand an interface in any ways with the TypeScript compiler. There's a lot of stuff on here. It's basically a lot of stuff going on there. Like for instance, the TypeScript type checker is like a 40,000, now 50,000 line of code file, and there's this meme here that was posted by one of the people on the team, which I think only the people on the team really understand it. And there was this one quote from Orta, who was the former community lead at TypeScript, I believe. And basically what he's saying here is, yeah, the universe would probably die before I figured out the type checker in TypeScript, which, having delved into it, is actually probably only a minor exaggeration. So despite that, and maybe my better judgment, I decided I wanted to try and make something, and I started working on it. I kept working on it, and at times I felt like the universe would die before I figured it out, but I did end up creating something which I called TypeScript Explorer. And you can go check it out, and if you have your computers, if you so wish, I put a QR code as well. And I can just demo this really quick. Basically the idea is you just open up type tree view. I click on button, and you give it a second, and there's all your props. No problem. You can go through. I can search if I want on clicked. Whoops. Say I want to search for a specific function. Well, I don't know why it doesn't work right now. That's how it works. You demo stuff and stuff breaks. But you can go through, find whatever you want, right? Functions gives you the arguments. You can go to see the the definitions of things. Let's show you. You can hover for JS doc and so on. And because I do care, I went through and I also supported like all of these, generic types. It supports type parameters, recursive types. We'll just sort of go on, forever here. Conditional types are supported, inference types, map types, generic functions. I want to do everything. And it turns out this has mostly been useful actually to library authors because they write all of these like crazy complex types, and there's like 7 intermediate types they have to understand. So anyways, as it turns out, making this sort of thing is pretty interesting and has a lot of challenges associated with it. So I want to talk a little bit about some of those. And if you do elect to make something like this, the first sort of big challenge you run into is essentially, you have so the way that it works in VS Code, right, is you have the extension host, which is sort of what runs the VS Code extension in sort of a nice sandboxed environment. That makes sense. It's like for security reasons, it's totally isolated. I think it runs in its own process. And then you have the TypeScript language server, which is sort of the thing that houses all the type information and any sort of extra info that you end up getting, like hover info. That's all the TypeScript language server. That's its job. And you can write compiler plugins which extend the capabilities. So the basic problem is, like, this is our UI that we want to show over here in the extension side. And this is like the underlying low-level type information that we want to show. And that lives on the TypeScript language server. And of course, these two things are very, very sandboxed. They're very isolated from each other. So the question is, how do you bridge the gap? Fortunately, Orta provided a PR. It's PR number 138,279 on VS Code, which allows you to sort of do this, but only for like a specific set of kind of allowed LSP commands. The idea is, if I'm in a VS Code extension, I can create this sort of a, like a payload saying, hey, here's this position that I want to check out. And I can go, say, for instance, make a completion info request to the TypeScript server. And that'll go generate the JSON associated with, let's say, the completion info, the completion box, send it back. So it sort of allows me to hook in to the TypeScript server at a low level. And the problem, of course, being, well, I can only do what it allows me to do. And of course, I want to be able to do all this custom stuff. So really what I want to be able to do is run my own code on the TypeScript language server, essentially have my own RPC endpoint. And so this, I thought, was like basically the project was dead in some way for a while. But then if you take a look at this trigger character line here, it turns out that's not actually that important. You can't mess with these things when you make the requests in the VS Code API. You can mess with this. So I had this idea, this devilish idea. I was like, well, what if you just like throw a JSON object in there? What would happen? It's supposed to be a string. And it turns out, nothing goes wrong. There's no validation at any step here. So what you can kind of do is you can just put a JSON thing in here, send it over, and then your compiler plugin notices that you've sort of hijacked the endpoint, and then sends your custom response, runs your custom code, sends that over. And so you effectively have something like a custom RPC endpoint onto the TypeScript server, which, like in English, that means you can just kind of do whatever you want on the TypeScript server. You have full control and power, and that's pretty awesome. So, like, the interesting thing about this, I felt, was like basically hijacking this extension this way is kind of a terrible solution. It's like going to cause all kinds of issues probably in various ways, potentially, but it works. And kind of the interesting thing that I've realized, having taken, if you ever take the time to look beneath the hood of a lot of these, compilers and sort of tools, browsers, things that we all use and rely on, it's actually not that uncommon to have like some critical piece of jank that everything kind of just relies on. You know what I mean? I think there was a point in time where I was a developer and I was like, I would refuse to ship this. But I kind of have gotten to a point where I'm like, well, sometimes either you ship jank or you ship nothing. You know what I mean? So that was my solution. That gives us RPC. That allows us to run code that we want on the TypeScript server and present it. Then the next thing is, well, now I have to understand, the type checker and the type system in TypeScript. Little thing to do, right? So this is sort of the basic idea of the TypeScript compiler at a high level, right? It goes through all these different stages. You don't really need to worry about it too much. The main thing that we're focusing on here is the type checker, which houses, again, all the type information. And just to give you a sense, because I think it's kind of funny, so like here's this file in action, or just so you can sort of, I don't know, look at it with some emotion of some kind. And yeah, it's currently 50,000 lines. And you can see here I have a debugger running. And this is all just kind of the call stack that you get when you run through the type checker down here. So it just kind of keeps going. But as it turns out, so also Orta has a really great talk if you want to check it out on sort of the TypeScript compiler, which I would recommend. It's very, very simple to watch. He does a really great job. So I thought to talk more about the compiler API, which is the API you use to interface with the type checker, is this website ts-ast-viewer.com. I want to invite anyone on a laptop to check it out if you want. Follow along. I guess I have a separate window here. Yeah. And so what's really cool about this website is you can just go through and see exactly how TypeScript sees, like at an internal level, how TypeScript actually sees these things. So here I have like all the syntax nodes. We also have on the right the type information. And internally in TypeScript, there's this notion of like flags. And so like for instance, this has the object flag, which lets you know that it's an object type. And it has symbol information, which is sort of the things that get defined in a TypeScript project, if that makes sense. So like objects, functions, things that you export, they have symbols associated with them. And the cool thing with TS-AST Explorer, if I just get rid of this, is if I go into the console, I can actually like interface with this stuff directly at the level of TypeScript. So what I'm actually able to do here now is I can introspect the TypeScript using TypeScript. Does that make sense? Because the TypeScript compiler is also written in TypeScript. Don't worry about the paradox there. And so, again, just using like JavaScript here, I can basically go through and figure out any information that I want to about this object. So for instance, I can say type.getProperties, I believe. Oh, is it properties? Yeah, get properties. And this will give me like the list of all of these different, here's field 1. And then this is like a symbol, so it has some type associated with it. And if you want to figure out what's the type of some particular thing here, you check the flags, for instance. And it gets like a lot more involved for like functions and so on, right? Arrays are also object types because arrays are object in JavaScript, right? But I always thought this was like really cool, right? Because like here you have access to introspect TypeScript at your whim, all from within JavaScript, right? So that's like the basic idea. And then in the actual implementation, all that I really need to do now is write the code on the TypeScript on the language server side that just runs through this low-level compiler information, converts it into the relevant information for the UI, and sort of sends it back through. And so that's the basic idea. I have some more stuff here. I'm just going to skip for now. We might come back to it. So there were a lot of like remaining challenges that I had around like function signatures, generics, recursive, lazy. Basically what this essentially boils down to is you have to figure out, you have to basically go through this source code file because none of it's documented and figure out, well, how do I determine if this is an array type? How do I determine if this is a generic? And so on, right? And then you sort of go through and you do that. Sorry, I'm sort of going through. And then, yeah, so that's like the basic idea. And then there were some non-technical things I also wanted to talk about when I made this project. And like the first thing was you should definitely finish your projects that you work on. I know a lot of people come out here to SFNode who are like maybe looking for their first job or something, right? And so after I finished this project, it actually sort of kickstarted my career. I got like a ton of opportunities from it. And it was really just because like when I made the thing, right, like I just took the time to like document everything, right? Reach out to people, post it in places. And it's really shocked me the amount of like opportunities that I've had from it. Like teams at companies will reach out to me about them using it. Like still get people reaching out to me about it. So that was just kind of crazy. And I would never have expected that, if that makes sense. And so it's definitely worth it to like take the time, to add tests and documentation and so on, when I was building this, I found like a power user. It was like one person on Discord who was really into it. And that one user would give me like paragraphs on paragraphs on paragraphs of like feedback. And like the thing is like most users that I knew would just be like, oh, this is cool. And that would be kind of it. You know what I mean? And so, it really just takes one person who is really into what you're doing to give you the feedback that you need to like make it really great, you know. And the reason it was so feature complete in the end was largely because of like this one person, you know. And then also, I think a lot of people, like you look at a 50,000 line file of code or whatever, and you're like, I'm out, you know. But I think a lot of this like problem of persisting through hard problems, you know, is about just, it's not just about persisting, it's about having the confidence that that persistence will be worth it, you know what I mean? And that's kind of what gets you through. If you didn't believe that it would be worth it, you wouldn't do it, you know. So that's like basically the talk. I can go more in depth on stuff afterwards if you're interested, since there's a lot more discussion to be had about, you know, internals of the TypeScript compiler. But I want to give a huge thanks to DydaS, who's the person who gave me all the feedback and stuff, to Christian Broman specifically for inviting me out, and the team at SFNode at large, and of course to the Quizlet team for having me out. So thank you very much. And thank you. If there's any questions, now's the time.
Show the extension that you built.
I did.
Well, partially, but what does it
Oh, well, yeah, here. Here. Well, yeah, like it lets you basically infer, you know, go through types. You can go to the type definitions if you want, right? Like, for instance, like for this type, if we go to color, it'll show you the different options for color, right? Different options for disabled and so on, right? It shows, I mean, you can go to the definitions and stuff. I don't know. That's the idea. Is there more?
Do you, how's the definition connected? Like, how do you get the, is this a link within, that's the TypeScript compiler gives you this definition for it?
Yeah, so the idea with the TypeScript compiler, right, is it has this notion of, let me show you, it has this notion of a symbol. So that's essentially, you know, during the process of the TypeScript compiler, it starts as just text, and it goes through and it chunks out all the different nodes in the document, right? So like const, object, field, and so on, in this example, right? And then sort of, you know, then it has to figure out like these objects that exist within an entire scope, like an object, a function that you call, and it puts those all in a big table, and that's this table of symbols or whatever, right? So that, for instance, here object is a symbol, and so it has a symbol associated with it. And so symbols have, as you can see here, a declaration, which basically tells me the end. I think there's a start or like pose. And so it'll give me a range associated with that particular symbol, if that makes sense. And also, like I think somewhere in here, it'll tell me the location in source code or whatever. And so that's like the idea. And so like, you know, if you have like an interface, you can see like TypeScript has this notion of interface merging, right? P number or whatever. And so when I click on interface merge, oh, let me click on interface merge. It's gonna, well, it's like kind of screwed up, but whoop, there we are. You can see like symbol, whoop, symbol dot declarations. Now we have two declarations because this thing gets merged, and technically it has two fields now. It's just the way TypeScript works. It like won't error here. It'll just sort of bring them together, and then you can sort of go through and cycle through. And so like in my extension, like it sort of will cycle through definitions, I believe. Like when you click on the thing, right down like this.
Did you use the compiler API or you built the parser?
No, so I'm using the compiler API. Using a compiler extension, which lets me basically run custom code over on the TypeScript server, and then like hijacking an RPC endpoint to run my own code on the compiler, if that makes sense. And then I can make a custom request down and get my custom information for the tree back. If that makes sense.
What
yeah.
about you could run your compiler server somewhere else? And
you could.
REST API?
You could do that, and like some other people have attempted that. The trouble with like doing this sort of thing is like, well, for one, yeah, like mainly performance. Like imagine like a typical TypeScript server like experience. Now imagine two of those running at the same time, right? And then there's a few other things. Managing your own like instance of TypeScript server is actually not super trivial. You have to like manage things, you know, other things. You might get a version mismatch between your project version and your version and so on. I definitely wanted to avoid that at all costs. For sure. Yeah. What? Anyone?
Yes, I have a question. question. So
Yes.
you mentioned earlier you got feedback from one power user. Did you get any different feedback from your other non-power users? Were there any recurring themes from them?
Yeah, I did get a number of things. I think originally, so like the power user was like, I want to have all of these crazy edge cases work, symbol names, and like all of these crazy types. I think the main thing that most normal users were concerned with originally was performance. It was a really big challenge to make the performance better. One of the big things I had to introduce was like lazy loading. So for instance, like what actually happens is like you'll see if I click on this, there's like a little loading thing there for a second. And that's because like it's not actually loading the entire tree. If that makes sense. It's like going down, and what it does is it sort of uses the location of this thing to resolve it back. If that makes sense. And that was a pretty big challenge originally. And there were other things like making sure that like you wouldn't go down too far in the tree unnecessarily, like for things that you didn't need, and all sorts of other things that are super weird. And basically, yeah, performance was the big one, and it continues to be a concern because like you'll just get these insane TypeScript projects where like it'll still take 10 seconds to load anything, you know.
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, I might as well just say, like, great presentation. This was like really amazing what you did. And what I really liked about your talk was you talked about the project management aspect.
Oh yeah.
It's almost like a comment, but I really loved your like. Sometimes there's just a ball of jank code that
Yeah.
makes all the other code work. And that's gonna be like my tweet of the year.
You hit tweet?
Yeah.
Yeah. There you are.
I'm just a friend about it. I haven't tweeted it yet, but like.
Gotcha. It's still in the drafts.
I would love for you to write a blog post about your project management experience with this. My question was kind of related to that, which is, I've been debating with a lot of friends about like when you refactor code, and I'm curious like how many contributors you have on this project, and are you gonna like try to refactor that sort of like jank code, or are you just gonna kind of, if it's broken, don't fix it? What's your strategy?
That's a great question. I did have this power user was contributing at the time. Now it's mostly just people making issues. Like now it's pretty much just me working on it. There's a lot in there that I do actually want to refactor out at some point. I think like the weird thing with this project is it's like when you do compilers, it's like there's so much stuff. Does that make sense? Like it's essentially like a big ball of like everything is interacting with every other thing. If that makes sense. I think the thing that gives me, like the most important part for me from the project standpoint was having a good testing suite. That makes sense. I ended up writing a ton of like a whole custom testing suite to have like really good sort of snapshot testing. That makes sense for everything. And at least then I know, when I go in and change things, that like everything doesn't instantaneously break. At least. I think the other problem is like there's like a 2-pass system right now. That makes sense. And I felt like by making a 1-pass system, that might make things a little bit more elegant. The trouble with this particular kind of jank is like really the solution needs to be like an upstream sort of PR to VSCode, if that makes sense. And kind of until that happens, for that particular piece of jank, there's not a lot you can do. I have talked with, there's another person who reached out to me who's doing the same thing, and we came up with a system to make sure that it doesn't break as many other extensions as possible. If that makes sense. Yeah, I don't know. I definitely think like I don't know. I'll have to think about that. I think ultimately, because it's like I don't know if the benefit of like refactoring this whole thing, like would be worth it. But like I don't know. I'll get back to you on that one.
Yeah, probably don't refactor.
Yeah, I guess so. I felt like the thing about it is like no matter what I do, I feel like it's going to be. This is so much interconnected parts that I'm dealing with. It's kind of like the TypeScript compiler is fundamentally kind of jank, if that makes sense. And so it's kind of like any interaction with it is going to have to interface with like 20 different things. And so it's like you just end up being jank by association or something, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, thank you. Thank you very much for your kind words. I really, really appreciate it. Yeah, any other questions? Yes. Yeah, it was actually a multi-step process of discovery. Originally, I wanted to just add like an extra property on the object. That makes sense. I felt that like that would be fine. But then I realized it like went through VS Code source code and realized it all got. Here I can go to the maybe go to the relevant slide. I would like go in through. We're over here, I think. Yeah. I went through the VS Code source code and was like, okay, well, they got stripped, and then I noticed that the other stuff wasn't getting stripped, and then I was like, well, what would happen if I just, and then I just put a JSON object in there pretty much. Like it was pretty much like the last resort, if that makes sense. And then a combination of that and going through, VS Code source code to make sure that, it would actually work. What was funny was another person who reached out to me, like independently did the same thing. So like, I could only be so crazy. Or maybe we're just both crazy. But yeah, so does that answer your question? Sort of?
Like, for like the object part, like, I guess like, is that like on the TypeScript server side? Like, was it expecting
Right.
an object? Like, or is it more like whatever you pass in,
Yeah, it turns, so it's like, it goes through like, here, it goes through this whole, it goes through like from the VS Code extension through the extension host into VS Code land, through the TypeScript language server into the compiler plugin. So it's like, it's basically at all stages. And the fascinating thing is there's no validation at any stage for this particular thing. And if there was, you could maybe keep it as a string and then like JSON parse it or something. Use another endpoint. There's like other options that you can use. But yeah, so the TypeScript language server also doesn't do anything. Although I don't think I checked the source code there because I don't know, it just worked, Does that answer the question?
I think so. Like, is there like a tree thing in the compiler plugin that like you're kind of just like jumping through all the hoops of like each?
Yeah. There's a. I mean, it's like I think it gets parsed through standard in as like a JSON thing, if that makes sense. And then I think it just doesn't. It just keeps getting passed through, and at no point does it expect the thing to be a string. Like the idea is within the compiler plugin, you can sort of override the default behavior of the endpoint that you normally would get, if that makes sense.
Oh.
Yeah, sorry. So I think that's it. So yeah, so then you can basically, so that's why it doesn't like error out, if that makes sense. Yeah, sorry. That was what you were looking for, I think. Cool. Yes.
Okay, this is less a code question, or explains some. Okay, so you make your open source project, you have it on GitHub, you've gotten some feedback from your power users and so on.
Yeah.
The gap between that and having people contact you for opportunities, was that just because it's sitting on GitHub with good SEO, or did you do some talk about it on like Discord servers and stuff like that? What was the
I think I posted on Reddit, maybe. I talked about it on Discord. I really didn't promote it that much, and I don't know where people. I think people find it maybe on the VS Code marketplace.
Yeah, because it sounds really super useful, so I could see that.
Yeah.
Just enough to attract people in. But,
Yeah, but I mean, it wasn't like crazy. I mean, I wasn't like getting my emails knocked out or anything. It was just like a few people, but it felt like a lot.
Oh, wait, well, I do have a code question.
Yeah.
In the hypothetical case where, say, the button tag has, in the future, 2 new props come in, right?
Yes.
Does your machinery there feed through and just get it automatically, or do you have to update your plugin with those 2 new props?
There's like a refresh button you can use.
Okay, so it takes care of itself.
Yeah, pretty much. It just uses like whatever you would see in like completions or like hover info. It's the same mechanism.
Okay.
So yeah, it'll just auto update. So it's kind of sort of like, I don't know, like API docs that just use TypeScript to figure themselves out, kind of maybe. I don't know if that's overselling it. But yeah. Cool.
Yeah, so you were talking about like how you were having some problems with this finding nice packages. Like if I wanted to use this, would there be any gotchas? I need to hold off using it.
You're sorry, with other packages?
I'm just saying like if I wanted to use this myself,
Yeah.
would there be any like gotchas?
Gotcha.
Or anything like that?
No, well, like sometimes it's kind of like for really, really big projects, it can be a little slow. That's the main thing. So like for instance, that 50,000 line file in TypeScript, it might not play too well with, but for instance, usually they just ironically disable the TypeScript server anyway when they develop. But no, like there's no incompatibility. It uses the same thing that that you use. Oh, that was what. Yeah, sorry. like you might have to disable it if you're on like a Svelte project. It doesn't support Svelte. It doesn't support like Vue. It's something we're interested, like I'm interested in, but it's sort of like, you know, like whatever the complexity of this was, like, you know, it's. Sorry?
As long as you stay in React.
Yeah, exactly. React is fine. TypeScript standard is fine. But usually, if you have like a specific, if you need Svelte for something, like you can just disable this extension for that project. If that makes sense. That tends to work fine. But yeah, that's like the main thing. But for the most part, it should be fine. You can install it. And definitely, if you do run into any issues, let me know on the issue page. It'd be very, very useful. Was there another 2 more?
I just had a question. You said that you this gives you a lot of job opportunities. Was this before you ever got open source?
Yeah, actually, yeah. So yeah, like this was like useful because I ended up working at a developer experience company, and this was like a big part of that. And then yeah, I mean it wasn't a lot. Like it's like maybe 3. Like maybe I got like 2 people reaching out to me, and then like one that I reached out to. Does that makes sense?
Like this was like you were already working?
No, I wasn't working when I made this. This is like pre-career. Yeah, it was pretty crazy. Like I didn't even think, like that's the thing is like, you know, a lot of people say, oh, like I've heard people be like, projects are overrated or whatever, and maybe for some career paths they are, but I feel like if you can make something that's like really unique and useful, that will separate you and like finished and complete, you know. I think that can be a surprising amount of opportunities that can come from that, if that makes sense. And like again, I didn't even put a huge amount of effort into this, so it's like, well, what if I made 10 more projects and took them even more seriously, you know? Yeah. Do you have a question?
Oh yeah, I was curious, like with the compiler extension, like does that come pre-bundled with your VSCode extension as well, or is like some kind of hack to have to install a compiler extension alongside or something like that?
Very good question. I can talk to you more about it later if you want, but basically there is a notion of a TypeScript compiler plugin, which is compiler specific, if that makes sense, and that's like something built into TS server. And so the idea is you can provide a module that sort of gets access to all of the language server endpoints, RPC endpoints, and it allows you to hook into them and override them, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And you can run that on type. So actually, this wouldn't just be VS Code. It could run in like NeoVim or something, and that's planned. The sort of idea is, in a VS Code extension, there's a special contribution point. Are you familiar with VS Code extensions at all? Okay. There's a special thing you can do where you can say, whenever a user has this extension enabled, load this custom compiler module into the TypeScript compiler, if that makes sense. And that's sort of the idea. And I think that's also how a number of other sort of similar things work. There's like a famous extension which will like make all of your TypeScript errors human readable, and it does the same thing.
So can I then load my own custom parser? So like, so first question is, in your TypeScript parser, does it support JSX? It looks like it does support
Yes.
JSX, or you have to add another plugin for JSX?
No, well, JSX and TSX are part of like the TypeScript itself, right?
So now my question is, if I want to add my own custom parser, can I?
Yeah. Well, like, is this sort of like maybe similar to Svelte, where you have like a TypeScript thing?
It's a DSL, yeah. It can
Okay. Actually, so yeah, so I'd say for that sort of a thing, I think the way that something like Svelte works is it has its own, you can somehow, I think, register your own language server, right, within VS Code. But then all this stuff I'm talking about, the compiler API, you basically wrap, like, instead of this, which like is like from within the compiler API, you sort of encapsulate it, if that makes sense. And you bubble up all of the errors that you get in that region up through to the like relevant endpoints, if that makes sense. That makes sense, sort of. I think that's how it's done in Svelte, and like if you wanted to make like a lit HTML thing, it would be the same sort of idea of you. Yeah, does that sort of answer the question? Or?
So custom
Cool.
language server I can add.
Yeah, and again, you would want to, in that case, you would want to run your own TypeScript server instance, probably. Yeah. Cool. Any more questions? Or? Cool. All right. Thank you.